Hello and welcome to Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Cory Sheffield, Research Scientist and Curator of Invertebrate Zoology with the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, will be speaking about diversity, ecology, and conservation status with focus on bees of the prairies. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I'd like to mention that there is only one webinar left in Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Join us tomorrow at 12 p.m. for a presentation about carbon sequestration by Destiny McGee from the University of Northern Iowa. You can register for this webinar on the PCAP website. Just click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week. And if you missed a webinar that happened earlier in the week, you can find it on the PCAP YouTube channel. A reminder to our listeners out there, if you have any questions, just type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you're using the cell phone app, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Enbridge and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Eco-Friendly West, Information Services Corporation, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and in-kind support has been provided by the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter. Cory grew up in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley, one of the region's main agricultural areas. Cory completed undergraduate and master's degrees at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, studying botany and entomology, which ultimately became pollination biology. He then completed a PhD at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, and then postdoctoral and research associate positions at York University in Toronto. Cory came to Saskatchewan in 2012, and he has worked in Regina at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum as Curator of Invertebrate Zoology ever since. With adjunct professor status with the University of Regina, and he has a wonderful family here. Cory's main research interests are bee taxonomy, diversity, and conservation, and their roles as pollinators of native and crop plants. So with that, I am pleased to pass it over to Cory.
Okay, can you see everything okay?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, I will start moving in. So, hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about bees, well, mainly about bees, but to put them into context of the bigger theme of pollination in the prairies, I'm going to provide some information on some of the other pollinators in Canada and also in the prairie provinces as well, just from the just to build the context of how diverse they are, but also when we start to consider you know, their conservation status or what makes these species at risk, it's nice to make comparisons of the life histories of the pollinators to see how that affects their you know, their conservation status. So just a quick review of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to quickly talk about pollination and pollinators to you know, just to let you know what pollination is and what it's not. I'm then going to quickly summarize the pollinator diversity and conservation status for Canada based on some assessment work that was done back in 2015. Then I'm going to jump right into bees, which is the group that I'm most passionate about and what I work on, specifically what they are and why they're important. And then I'm going to cover topics of bee diversity in Canada, and then go back to talk more about the conservation status of bees in Canada, more specifically try to explain some of those results that we saw. And that is going to be more based on life history traits of bees, more so than the typical threats we hear about in terms of like pesticides, things like that. I'm also going to, close to the end, I'm going to talk about cuckoo bees as indicator taxa for the status of bee populations. It's an area that I started working on back in 2000, well, in the early 2000s, but it's sort of a neat area that I think is has some implications for assessing bee populations. And then I'm going to provide just a summary of some resources that are available if you're interested, which I can provide links to later on. So pollination, is one of the key steps of plant reproduction, or angiosperm or flowering plant reproductions. And simply put, it's just the delivery of pollen, which are these red grains you can see here, from the anther or the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, actually the tip of it, the stigma here. And it only refers to the delivery. What happens afterwards, such as fertilization and seed development, is not necessarily, it's not pollination. So I guess this is important distinction to make, because often you can have really, really good pollination, but not get fruit or seed production because, other issues come into play, such as pollen compatibility or, pollen viability. So it's important to make those distinctions, because often pollinators can be blamed, or lack of pollinators can be blamed for lack of getting seed yield or fruit yield, but we really have to look to see what's actually happening to see if it is a pollinator problem or something else. And pollination can happen by abiotic means, so a lot of trees are wind pollinated, or biotic, which would include animals. So globally, there are a large number of animals that visit flowers, including in Canada. In many cases, especially if you go up into higher elevations or up north, flies become more important as pollinators than even bees. So when you look at pollination by animals, not always insects, but looking at their behavior is important, and I will talk about that later on as we go through. So another important distinction to make is the difference between floral visitors versus pollinators. So many types of insects visit flowers, but not all of them are actually pollinators. Some of them are there. They directly consume the floral tissue, so in fact maybe damaging the plant reproductive tissues. In some cases, like the yucca moth, for instance, there's a balance between sacrificing plant tissues to still ensure that some reproduction is happening in the plant communities. But so when you see beetles like this beautiful longhorn beetle on a rose flower, it's probably not making big contributions to the reproductive success of this rose, but they are quite common on flowers. So the important point is, don't assume that what you see on a flower is actually a pollinator. You really have to look at what they're doing there. So when you look at a range of different, this is a range of insects on some flowers. The fly up in your upper left-hand corner is just sitting there. It's a flower fly, so they do make important contributions to pollination, but the beetle on the upper right is there consuming tissue. So if you think about what the floral rewards that flowers offer pollinators, such as nectar and pollen, you really have to look at their behavior to see what's actually happening. If they're collecting pollen, there's a good chance that they're moving pollen from one flower to the next, which facilitates pollination. If they're there consuming the plant tissues, they still might move a little bit of pollen around, but it's probably proportionally much less so than what a bee or a moth would be doing, for instance. So the number of pollinators, I'm going to focus on Canada, but globally there's tens of thousands, if not more, species of insect that visit flowers. So this is a poster that was done by the Canadian Wildlife Federation a few years ago, which provides a nice snapshot of sort of a large resolution of what is actually visiting flowers in Canada. And you can see both vertebrates and primarily invertebrates, so bees, butterflies, some beetles, etc. And these are the main groups of animal pollinators that we would find in Canada. So you'd have to be living under a rock if you haven't heard anything about pollinator declines in the news or other social media in the last little while. So I want to talk a little bit about that, particularly what we've been doing in Canada for the last little while. So in 2015, this Wild Species 2015 report was was published, and this is sort of our most comprehensive assessment of conservation assessment of wildlife in Canada. So when I say wildlife here, I mean plants, animals, basically everything that's alive in Canada. So when this one was done in 2015, about 30,000 species broken into 34 different taxonomic groups were done, and this was still, there's still many groups of organisms that have not been done yet. But when we did this, I was actually involved in the doing the general status assessment for bees in Canada. So I looked at it both nationally and within each province and territory. So when we do these conservation ranks using this for wild species, we use the NatureServe. That's what I'm looking for. We use their methodologies to do this, and I put this slide up here this is the most important part. Then in your lower left-hand corner, the lower the number associated with a group, the more at risk it is. So 1 by NatureServe means it's critically imperiled, versus 5, which means it's secure, so species that we aren't concerned about. And then another, this U means unrankable. So a species can be unrankable if we don't have a lot of data on it. So as a person that studies bees at the collection here at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, we have some species here that are known from one single specimen collected in Canada. So it's really hard to know if that species is at risk or not based on the fact we only have one record of it in Canada. So the safer bet is just to say they're unrankable just because we don't have data for them. So I just pulled the data off for these different, so for some of the pollinator taxa, and you can see here that for butterflies in Canada, the green color here you can see is sort of associated with those higher numbers, so N4 up to N5. You can see that over 3/4 of the butterfly species in Canada, at least in 2015, were thought to be, secure or mostly secure. So that's the green color there, but you do have a few species that are at risk, and those are the red colors that you see there. What's important to note here is that the NU, or the gray color, is barely visible on this, and it's because butterflies are typically one of the best studied groups of insects and pollinators in Canada. So you can even think with programs like iNaturalist, where people are actually taking photos. This is all contributing to the data we have for butterflies. Butterflies are like the birds of the insect world. Basically, everybody loves how beautiful they are, and they're quite obvious insects. So the data sets we have to do these assessments is much better than other groups, like the moths, for instance. Some moths are really well known, but I've highlighted the fact that the assessment was done mostly on macro moths, or the larger moths. You have a whole bunch of moths that are very tiny and taxonomically very hard to tell one species from another. You certainly can't do it with photographs, but when you start to look at macro moths in Canada, you can see that although you still have probably 60% of them that are sort of fall into this green or secure category, you have almost 1/4 of the species that we don't have enough data on to actually assess them. Very few fall into that red or the endangered category, but as one of the trends that you're going to see here with these different pollinators, as the groups that we know less about, the more uncertainty we have. So flower flies would be the next group I'll put in here. You can see almost 1/3 of the species we don't have enough data on to know what their conservation status rank is, and then about half of them seem to be secure, and then that other probably 1/5 or so is sort of at risk to we're slightly concerned about. And then finally the bees, the group I did, you can see here 1/3 of the species occurring in Canada or more, it's getting closer to 50%, they were unrankable. So we just don't have enough data to look at them, and roughly, I don't know, maybe 1/3 of the species fall into that secure, and then you can see various levels of a very few species are ones that we would consider endangered species, but there are quite a few that fall into species we really have to keep an eye on. So that's just a general snapshot of the main pollinator groups. And coming back to the theme of this conference, when we start to look at Canada, but specifically the prairies, this map of Canada basically shows you species at risk in Canada, or the proportion of species, and you can see it's really along the U.S. border, but primarily you can see there the big red area that corresponds to the Canadian prairies. The Canadian prairies, or grasslands, typically globally are one of the most at-risk types of areas, and of course the species that live there follow suit and are large. Some of them are largely at risk as well. So the Canadian prairies, and also sort of the grasslands of southern British Columbia and then southern Ontario, are sort of the key areas for where species at risk occur. So when you start looking at those same groups of pollinators in Canada, you can see that when you look at so I put the red box around the prairie provinces, but when you look individually at sort of the prairies, or those three provinces, you can see that a much higher proportion of them are unrankable, or the grayscale areas of these bars. So that's your moths and butterflies, your flower flies, and your bees as well. So in summary, we have been looking at the species, but we keep adding new species all the time. But there are certain groups of pollinating insects that we certainly need a lot more data on them to really know how they're doing from a conservation standpoint. We do have some that are secure, but we have many that we don't have enough information about. So in this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on the bees and talk about some of the reasons why some of these species are at risk, and it's going to be focused on life history more than some of the other reasons you think about. So there are a range of external threats to pollinators, so predators and diseases. So this is a picture of a Cavities, or a chelidid bee, that I collected in Nova Scotia, and you can see when I caught this bee, it was on the ground, but it was being pulled to the ground. It was caught by these groups of ants. So there are at least 3 ants that have bitten onto the body of this bee, and good thing I rescued it and put it in a killing charge so I could put it in a museum so the ants didn't get it. But these are sort of those natural threats to insects, which all bees would be facing threats from predators, spiders, birds, etc. But we're now starting to understand that there's especially when we talk about bumblebees, there's a bunch of diseases that we're starting to learn more about, and these also have pose threats to our different pollinators. But one of the big thing that causes sort of or creates threats to most pollinators are land use patterns. So how we use land. So you can think of agriculture. To grow food, we need to use a range of chemicals to help grow food, whether it's fertilizers or pesticides. But in making room for crop plants, we also cause a loss of some of these natural floral resources for our pollinators. And so land use for agriculture can affect pollinators in several ways. So I'm not going to focus on this talk on the pesticides at all, because I think you can find lots of information on the impact of that on pollinators. But again, I want to focus on the life history attributes of bees, that to discuss why some of them could be at risk. So again, here's a picture sort of I took from a plane flying over the prairies, and you can see that when you look at this picture, there's spotty wooded habitats surrounded by lots of agricultural land and some more urban type settings. Within this mosaic of landscapes, you would find bee populations in there, but in some areas it would be very devoid of bees and other pollinators, and it's just because that's the nature of land use. But when we start looking at the life history attributes of pollinators, some of them are going to be more at risk in habitats such as this than others, and I'm going to try to discuss why that is. But it revolves around where do they actually live within this landscape, and also what do they need to get from this landscape. So when you look at general pollinator life history, I will focus onto the right side first, which is the adult requirements. So adults, bees, butterflies, and flies all require nectar. That's sort of where that's sugar water that they get their energy to allow them to fly and do their business. Bees and some of these flower flies also require pollen, and bees more so than the flies, which I'll talk about shortly. But then nesting sites. Nesting sites are something that bees require, but butterflies and syrphid flies or flower flies don't nest. They basically move freely through the landscape and are not fixed to one spot. Not some, but not all bees also require nesting materials, so they have to collect resources to help them build nests, and then oviposition sites. So for Lepidoptera, your butterflies and moths, and also your syrphid flies, they need to find spots to lay their eggs. Bees do that in their nests, which I sort of talked about above. But the larval requirements are often quite different from the adults. So larval bees require nectar. So adult bees collect nectar and pollen, as you can see from the next thing, which they take back, and that's the food for their offspring. Food plants are vegetative things. So butterflies and moths will lay their eggs on plant tissues, and it's the caterpillars actually consume the vegetative tissues of the plant. So, and that could include flowers, it could include leaves. Syrphid flies are a little bit different because the immature stages of syrphid flies are mostly predaceous. So they need to have their eggs laid, where there's aphids or other things that they consume. And then, of course, larval bees are in a nest, so they have to have a place where they're, going to complete their development. Which, because these pollinators' lives are so closely linked to flowers, it's important to have, this is the Royal Saskatchewan Museum garden, but you can see there's a good diversity of plants at this one snapshot of time during the year, and you can see all of these stages within of these insects if you look closely in there. So we get species at risk here in this garden, but we've also some years more than others, we do find monarch caterpillars and adults in these habitats. So most of the pollinators I've mentioned so far are not fixed to specific locations. As I mentioned, bees build a nest, and once that nest is established, those adults basically will forage, in an area surrounding where that nest is. We call this central place foraging. So they find their food in an area around that nest site, and of course they're also exposed to threats around that nest site. So if a bee builds its nest in an agricultural landscape that's pesticides and other things are used, it puts itself at risk. If a bee builds its nest in the middle of the badlands of Saskatchewan, well, pesticides and things like that won't be a threat, but other things may become important there. So with bees are different from these other ones because, a butterfly or a syrphid fly or flower fly, if, they can move freely from one landscape to another because they really don't have a place that they have to go back to. They have to find the food plants and the larval food plants to lay eggs on, and they can search over a much wider area to do so. So I just basically mentioned this, butterflies, they can move. In this case, this is a butterfly collecting nectar, but when it goes to lay eggs, it can find a whole range of plants. It can also find nectar from a whole range of plants, and will move freely up and down, up corridors or across landscapes to do so. This is a picture, I don't know if you can see it or not, but these are bee nests. This isn't a bank in Avonlea, but this is a bee here that's building its nest. Once it's built this nest here, it sort of will complete its life, so it'll lay eggs within this bank, but all of its food is going to come from the surrounding landscape. And you can see here, well, this whole bank, there was probably 100 bees nesting in this bank like this. So that habitat has to be able to support a good number of adult bees, but also, they have to find enough pollen to take back to the nest to make sure that next year's populations are also going to be okay. So where is your food? So specific food resources for pollinators may be unevenly distributed across a landscape. So if you think of a large crop setting, it can be, very, very good for some pollinators for a very short period of time. But once that crop finishes flowering, the ability for these pollinators to find food becomes more difficult. The landscape becomes patchiness. And just to give you an example, this here map basically shows where all the Tim Hortons and Starbucks locations are in Canada and the US respectively. And you can see here that if you're addicted to, you know, these brands of coffee, in some parts of Canada and the US, you're very likely to be able to do optimal foraging in a very small area. But if you live, you know, more northern parts of Canada, you're going to struggle to find, you might have to resort to make your own coffee at home, which is something I would recommend anyway. But yeah, so this is sort of similar to what pollinators face in, you know, their landscape can change over the season, but you can think if you plow up land or a forest fire or something comes through, that might cause an area of very bleak resource availability, at least for the short term. This was a paper that was done, and it's focused on butterflies here, but I just sort of repeat this slide on the next one, is that if you're a generalist butterfly, so if you can collect nectar from a whole range of plants, when you're in a landscape that has good plant diversity, you can typically find floral resources, even if some of those plants are lost. Or you can even think it from the standpoint, in a plant community, they will flower at different times. Well, as one flower goes out and another one starts flowering, these bees, if they're generalists, they can typically switch from one plant to the other as that changes. But if you're a species of butterfly, and for butterflies, I'm also talking about the food plants that their caterpillars may need. If you're a habitat specialist, say if you only are found in, say, sand dunes, or if you have a specific food plant that you require, if some of those food plants are lost in the local landscape, it can be very, very difficult for them to find the food resources. And for butterflies, they may have to travel far or leave that area, or the local population may become extirpated because they don't have the resources they need. Well, you can apply that same scenario to most other groups of pollinators, especially if they have dietary specialization. So if you're a plant or a bee species that only will collect pollen from bluebells or monarda, if you lose the local populations of those plants, you're probably going to have losses of the local bee populations as well. So food restrictions for pollinators. So pollinators with these specialized food plant requirements, when we did those assessment for the bees, we found that if, you know, when you have very, very specific needs, so specializing at, say, the species level, that puts you at a higher at-risk level than a species that would be a generalist. And we've all heard lots about monarch butterflies needing milkweeds. So if you lose milkweeds or you have large reductions over an area, that's going to affect your butterfly populations as well. So the same is true for some of these bees. The ones shown in the picture here is a meleted bee, Macropus nuda, which is the only species of bee we have in Canada that collects floral oils from flowers of Lysomachia. So if you don't have Lysomachia populations nearby, you're not going to have these bees either. But with bees, there's other types of specialization. Some bees are called cuckoo bees, and they have to have hosts in those landscapes. So this here is a nice picture of Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, which is a cuckoo bumblebee in the nest of western bumblebee, which western bumblebee is one of the species that we've assessed in Canada as a threatened species. Well, if you're a cuckoo in the nest of a species which itself is at risk, it puts you even at greater risk because you have that level of specificity. So I realized I've taken quite a bit of time just sort of reviewing this, but now I'm going to jump into bees. So bees evolved from digger wasps. So when someone asks you, or if you're wondering what's the difference between a bee and a wasp, well, bees actually are a type of wasp, which will be made clear here in a moment. So bees evolved from digger wasps. So these are, you know, a large group of wasps, most which nest in the ground, but not all of them. And like bees, the adults feed on flowers, and it's quite easy when you see them on flowers to mistake a digger wasp for a bee. An important point is that digger wasps are, predators. So the protein that they feed their larvae. I talked about bees earlier feeding on pollen. Well, digger wasps are hunters, so they feed on insects or caterpillars. This is a cutworm moth being attacked by what we call a cutworm wasp. So they will sting, paralyze, and take these caterpillars back to their nest and lay their eggs on it, and that's what their offspring develop on. So the important point here is that there are many types of food prey specialization. You have some groups of these wasps which specialize on specific types of prey, which gets us into the question, well, where did bees come from? So I promise this is the only complicated figure I have on here, but basically in 2018, this phylogeny was published that looked at the digger wasps and bees to really see what the common ancestor was, or answer the question, where did bees come from? So one of the major results of this work is they took one of these groups, or the largest groups of digger wasps that were once considered one family, and broke it into 8 families. And within those 8 families, one of them, called the Amoplanidae, came out to be the closest living relative, or shared a common ancestor with the bees. And so this was pretty new and surprised a lot of people. But when you look at the biology of these little wasps, so this is one down here in your lower left-hand corner, these small wasps are thrip hunters, or hunt thrips. And so thrips, if any of you are gardeners and you look at your flowers, you'll often see these small, elongate little insects on flowers. Well, these wasps hunt thrips and take them back to their nests. So the idea that came along with this phylogeny is that this ancestral wasp taxon, because it was hunting these insects which would commonly be coated with flower or pollen from flowers, there was probably somewhere along the line a switch from hunting the thrips to just consuming the pollen that came from the flowers. So there was already a reason for this wasp ancestor to be visiting flowers to begin with. In addition to collecting nectar, it was there to collect these insects that were feeding on pollen and other plant tissues. So that's sort of in a nutshell where they think bees came from. And now bees have diversified greatly. So the difference between bees and wasps is that bees are basically vegetarian. So the protein that they feed their larvae comes from pollen. As I mentioned earlier, the adults also feed on, the adults and larvae are both fed nectar, the adults less so with the pollen, and as I mentioned, some bees also collect other floral rewards. So the interactions between plant and pollinator have in some cases become very specialized. But the big point is that all bees are dependent on flowers for food. So most bees have morphological and behavioral adaptations to collect pollen. Some bees, and I say most here because I'll talk about cuckoo bees in a moment, but you do have some of these anomalies. This is a bee that actually carries pollen inside its body, so it's a mostly hairless and looks a lot more like a wasp, but it is a true bee in that it still collects pollen for its offspring. And bees are, geologically speaking, are pretty recent. So anywhere between 110 and 130 million years, but since that time, it's their relationships with flowering plants that is sort of, you've had this coevolution of a diversification of around 20,000 bee species and, probably over 100,000 flowering plant species globally. And it's this interaction between plant and pollinator which has sort of shaped terrestrial ecosystems as we know them, or made it very diverse. So when you look globally, there's over 20,000 species of bees. And on this figure, the darker color shows you where there's more species of bees. So Alaska is something worth pointing out here because it doesn't have a high diversity of bees, but because it's part of the US, it came out as the same color of the US. So in Canada, we have just under 1,000 species of bees. So that's still pretty good. It's about a quarter of what you'd find in the US, particularly the southwestern US, which is one of the main spots of diversity for bees globally. So bee diversity in Canada, well, how many species are there in Canada? Where do they occur? And then I'm going to end by talking about functional diversity. So I've got to move rather quickly here, I think. But so this is the bee diversity by province, and the main biodiversity areas province-wide are BC, which is over 460 species. I think it's probably even higher than that now. and then Ontario. But you can see the prairie provinces are getting pretty good up there. Alberta in particular, because you have both the prairies but also the montane areas, which gives them a bit of an increase. But you can see Saskatchewan is holding quite nicely at somewhere between 250 and 300 species. This is a little bit of a dated figure, but I'm going to talk briefly about DNA barcoding, which is basically a genetic method we use to identify species. When we look at unique sequences of DNA, we find that some of these estimates for species richness may even be a lot higher. So what you can see here, and I'll just focus on BC, earlier I said there was about 450 species of bees. When we incorporate DNA barcoding, we now know that there could be as many as 600 species of bees in British Columbia, and the number for Saskatchewan is bumped up over 300. So this is exciting from a standpoint of someone that studies bee taxonomy, and that we're finding quite regularly new undescribed species of bees in Canada. And in some cases, we're getting new records for Canada as well. So the hotspots are the Western Interior Basin, or the sort of the Okanagan area of BC, the Prairie provinces, and also the Southern Ontario, Quebec. These are it's because of their proximity to the US, but also because of the uniqueness of these ecozones in Canada. If you look at the number of species per 1,000 kilometers square, you can see that this, the smallest ecozone in Canada, the Western Interior Basin, has by far the largest number of bee species in Canada. So it's just a remarkable area for that. And so this is a more recent figure, but in BC, 411 of the 483 bee species in BC occur in that area. And so that roughly 20% of the bees that occur in Canada occur nowhere else other than sort of the Okanagan or those low valley floors in BC. And it's sort of linked to the desert-like conditions there, which is where bees are most common globally, even, are these dry desert areas. So again, this is areas with unique fauna. So you can see this Western Interior area, because it's so dark red here, it means it has the highest level of bee endemism in Canada, so species that occur nowhere else. But you can see the prairies and also the mixed wood plains of Ontario and Quebec are similarly high as well. So species occur in the prairies that don't occur elsewhere in Canada. I won't spend time on this, but this basically shows, this red line shows the cumulative number of species we've added to BC over time. And really, BC has not really been studied that heavily. I'd say Saskatchewan even less so, but just within this last, few decades, we've really added a lot of new species. So some of these were new to science, and some of them are just new records there. So eventually we will be able to do something similar for each province in Canada and see when were most of the records described. And it sort of summarizes the effort to document biodiversity, how extensive that has been. Again, this is just more on bee diversity in Canada. So a little bit about barcodes, I just want to mention, because it sort of ties into our what we've done for assessing, the number of species in Canada, but also how we've assessed their conservation status. So using DNA barcodes, or these molecular, this is a DNA barcode down here, but using the genetic data in addition to the morphology. So this is sort of the butt of a male bee, and this is its genitalia and some other hidden parts of its body. We use all of these types of clues in order to put a name on a species. And what we started to find is that we are learning a lot more about the species richness in Canada, because the DNA barcoding is allowing us to account for morphological variation in species. So if you consider that some bee species are only known from the female, or some might be known from the male, when we use DNA barcoding, we can link them up and say, oh, that's not two species, that's actually just one species. And in other cases, we've been splitting bees into multiple species. So some examples of this was from a couple papers that I worked on a while ago. But when we use DNA barcoding, not only do we find that, if you look at the bee butts on the right side of your screen, these are actually the same species that occurs in both the melanistic or dark form and the light form, but also the male was described as a different species. So in this case, using DNA barcoding, we made two synonymies. So we took three species and combined them into one, which gave us a better understanding of the diversity. In another case, we actually used DNA barcoding. So morphologically, we couldn't tell these species apart at first, but when we looked at DNA barcoding, it said, oh, there's more than one species here. Then we linked that DNA up to some some nesting biology studies that were done, and using morphological data, genetic data, and ecological data, we actually described a new species of Ceratina from eastern Canada that we would not have known about if we had not used DNA barcoding as well. We've also used DNA barcoding to find, this was in 2016, I was part of a study that described, the first new species of bumblebee for probably 50 or 60 years, found in only a small part of the Yukon and Alaska. We would not have known about this if we would not have had DNA barcoding data. And now to tie it into bee conservation, we've been using this to clarify the status of some species. So in Saskatchewan, we have two species, Bombus terricola, which occurs right across Canada, and Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, which occurs from Saskatchewan, west of BC, and it was thought to occur up in the Yukon and Alaska. You can see here, terricola in the middle is pretty uniform, but occidentalis is morphological, very diverse until you get some points that it looks quite a lot like terricola. And at one time, it was considered a subspecies of terricola, but when we started using DNA barcoding, we realized that there was a lot of genetic variation within occidentalis, making us think there were probably multiple species there. So for a while, we actually then recognized, okay, there's two subspecies of occidentalis, McKayi, which occurs up in the north, and then occidentalis, which is the southern form that we get here in this province. So when we did the assessment, instead of assessing the range of occidentalis as being like this, we actually were able to assess both the northern subspecies, which came out as special concern, and the southern subspecies, which came out as threatened. And more recently, we now know these are two distinct species. So this is just as of 2021. So what puts our species at risk? As I mentioned, pesticides and pathogens are certainly getting a lot of attention. Loss of habitat due to agriculture, loss of floral resources, but also the life history traits. So I'm going to try to rush through some of this. But basically, bees differ in their nesting biology. Some of them, as I mentioned, most are ground nesters, but some of them actually nest in twigs or nest in holes in wood. So if you don't have nesting resources for them, you're not gonna have bee populations. But because bees are also dependent on plants, they also need to have floral hosts. So whether they're specific or more general in their approach, you need to have flowering plants in these habitats. So for nesting habitat, I mentioned earlier that this one that nests in these banks, it varies. Some of them need flat surfaces, some of them need vertical surfaces, but soil type is also going to be a factor for some species. And then some species prefer being in bare ground. Others need some type of vegetation or rock cover to help support their nesting. So bees will show preferences just like people do. Other bee species will nest in pre-existing cavities. So this is a wood that was loaded with leafcutter bees, but we've been able to sort of take advantage of this nesting habitat and building artificial nests that we can now use leafcutter bees and mason bees within agricultural settings to help with pollination. So that's exploiting the knowledge we've gained on the nesting biology of these species to help secure crop pollination. So for bees that nest in the ground, we cannot do a lot. I mean, we can sort of leave bare ground for them, but mostly we have to conserve these nesting habitats. So when we find areas where we know bees are nesting, we should leave them and for these species. But when it comes to these bees that nest in cavities, we have more options. So some bees will nest in unexpected places. So the top picture is actually showing a leafcutter bee. This one specializes in nesting in decomposing wood, and it can actually chew its way into these areas to make nests. And this bottom picture is of a species at risk, a western bumblebee that's nesting in an old barn foundation. So we sometimes will get bees nesting in places we don't want them, and sometimes they can be a little bit of a nuisance in that regard. But really in nature, beggars can't be choosers, so they're they're looking for whatever spots would be available to them. But we can also create nesting habitats. So some bee species actually make mud nests under stones. So in a study we did in Newfoundland, we actually used overturned plant pot bases, and you can see there's probably 30 or so bees in nesting cells underneath this plant pot, and these bees are blueberry specialists. The bottom picture basically shows that you can go to your neighbor's house at night with a drill and create nesting habitat by drilling holes in their patios or in their patio. These bees need pre-existing cavities, so we just have to make them for them. So again, this has lots of potential in agricultural settings, as I've mentioned earlier. These are those plant pot bases that are overturned in the blueberry field. And then even in your own yard, you can put up nesting blocks like this to attract bees. Other bees need nesting materials. So leafcutter bees are aptly named because they cut pieces off your rose bush and they make these thimble-shaped cells, which is what they fill with pollen and lay their eggs in. Food plants are the most important part. So this picture here comes from Danae Fryer, who works here at the museum, but it basically shows the body size of a hummingbird, which we know are very voracious in terms of visiting flowers or hummingbird feeders to get nectar. Well, some of our bumblebee queens probably approach or even surpass the overall body size of a hummingbird. So you can imagine that the energy requirement or some of these bigger bees is also quite great. So your landscape has to have lots and lots of flowers to support bee populations. So as I mentioned earlier, some bees are polylectic, or what we call pollen generalists, and they can visit a wide variety of plants to collect pollen for their larvae. Most of these tend to be more widespread species, and it includes both solitary bees in which all females lay eggs, and eusocial bee species like bumblebees in which you have a queen and she is the sole egg layer. So if you imagine a bumblebee, which I said was social, it needs to have plants available to them all through the season. So they emerge in the spring and they fly until fall. So you have to have plants available to them all season long, where some of the solitary bees only need to have plants in the spring or the fall. The pollen specialists or oligolectic bees are the ones that visit, a specific family like the sunflowers or even a specific plant species, which I talked about earlier. One of the things about the prairies is that we have the highest proportion of these pollen specialist bees of anywhere in Canada, and a lot of these are willow specialists or sunflower specialists. So it's sort of one of the areas that we excel as far as we know right now, that even the Western Interior Basin. When we did the conservation assessment, we found that a high number of these species were unrankable because we know they occur here, and we know in the US that they specialize on something, but we don't have the data here. So bees need ample food, as I mentioned, throughout the spring and summer. Some species will focus on plants in the spring, others on plants in the summer, and whether or not they're social or solitary is going to influence their requirements. So as I mentioned, you need to provide food for bees. Most wild bee species live longer than any specific plant or crop plant will be flowering. So you really have to think in the landscape, having food plants available to them, for at least, if not longer than how long they are alive. And remember that to produce a single bee, you need pollen from hundreds to, in some cases, thousands of flowers, depending on how small the flowers are, for instance. So yeah, just make sure you provide lots of flowering plants to your bees. That's one of the best things that you can do for bee populations. And this is sort of an example from our own yard, where we get lots of little bees like this Harriotes visiting the flowers. So I'm going to end by talking about cuckoo bees, and I'm sorry I'm taking up a bit more time, but cuckoo bees are a special group of bees that the females don't collect pollen, but they're still true bees in that they're dependent on pollen. So they get it by laying their eggs in the nest of bees that do collect pollen. And we have a high proportion of them in the prairies, but in the Maritimes is where we have the highest proportion. I don't think this is true. I just think this is where I'm from, and I really surveyed the heck out of the Maritimes when I lived there, and have a pretty good picture of what species occur in the Maritimes. So cuckoo bees are dependent on their host bee, and is this level of dependence I talked about earlier that makes them at greater risk, especially if they themselves specialize on a bee that it's itself at risk. So 46%, so almost 50% of the cuckoo bees in Canada we could not rank because we didn't have enough data for them. And from our DNA barcoding results, we have way more cuckoo bees than we presently have accounted for. So this number could actually get much higher. So I want to end talking about that cuckoo bees as indicator taxa that I mentioned. So this was from a study done over 40 years ago, but when you look at cuckoo bees, they can make up quite a large proportion of your fauna. So this is a study that was done, but the data that they used to basically say you have a higher proportion of cuckoo bees as you go further north basically excluded most, Canada, with the exception of this one dot, which is where up in the north you have two species of bumblebee and one parasitizes the other. So Canada was mostly lacking from this data. But what I found in my PhD work is that, landscape or land use patterns affect bee populations, and what these graphs show. So quickly, you have an area of intense agriculture, less intense agriculture. So mostly you have natural borders. You have fields that were one time used for agriculture, but now are not. And then you have natural meadows. Basically, these red bars show the proportion of cuckoo bees. And what this basically shows is that in intense agricultural settings, your diversity and abundance of cuckoo bees becomes much lower than in natural habitats. So this trend got me thinking, are these cuckoo bees or their lack of in these habitats showing us something about these populations? And when I started to look at the proportions of cuckoo bee species, so the species to their abundance, what I found is that when you get into natural and semi-natural habitats, not only do you have more cuckoo bees, but their diversity is much greater than down here, which are these really intense agricultural settings. So I proposed that these could be good indicator taxa, and basically to sort of provide support for that, I looked at the percentage of kleptoparasites within these habitats versus the total diversity of bees, and they basically follow the same trend. So cuckoo bees could be signifying what's happening in the larger bee communities. So within bees, you have, not all cuckoo bees share a common ancestor. You have cuckoo bees arising in completely separate lineages of bee populations, which sort of adds evidence that they could be providing good representation for the bee communities at large. And how this actually could work is that, when I started looking at dominance index, so in some cases you have one or two bee species that may dominate a bee community. Well, if you have cuckoo bees in that community, it can bring down those dominant species. And in fact, cuckoo bees, their presence in these habitats actually increases diversity overall. So I just want to end by saying, I talked a lot about how flowering plants are important for bees everywhere, but there are, if you don't know about these, the Pollinator Partnership has produced a series of good guides for planting, recommendations for native plants within different areas that are relevant to the prairies, which I put up. There's the link here, but I can certainly provide the link that can be mailed out to you as well. So there's 4 different guides for the different, depending on which part of the prairies you actually live. And another good resource, which is also freely available online, is this Bee Basics, which gives lots of good illustrations and is good general coverage for bees in North America. So if you want to learn more just about the general biology of bees, this is a really good resource for doing that. So with that, I'll put a plug in. If there's any students out there that are potentially interested in doing graduate studies, please contact me, and I'm ready now to answer any questions that anyone may have. I can't hear you.
Hear me okay now?
Yeah, now I can. Sorry, I wasn't able to hear you.
Okay.
I was tapping my ear to let you know that I couldn't hear, but
Sorry. And I had the screen, I had the question panel over your your webcam there. Sorry about that. So in the bee species map, most of Africa didn't show many species, but there's a lot of arid and semi-arid land there, which seems like the best bee habitat. Is the reason for lower numbers of species in Africa due to less research, or are there other reasons?
it's mostly less research. I mean, Africa is one of those areas. Many of the African countries, they're traditionally, because it's sort of one of those areas that African researchers are probably among the most underfunded globally. I know of a few people in South Africa that study bee taxonomy, and they're very prolific in describing new species, but most people that have studied bees in Africa are not from Africa. So I would say I mean, there are certain parts of Africa, like you mentioned, these hot areas, that there are species of bees unlike any place else in the world in Africa. So to answer your question, it's probably very, very diverse, but it's just we really haven't really got a good grasp on what's actually there. There's lots of new species being described all the time. So I think eventually, 20 or 30 years from now, you're going to see that map get darker, especially in those drier areas. But even some of the tropical areas of Africa, there's lots of cool things just waiting to be discovered there as well.
Thanks for that answer. Sydney is wondering about, how do you feel about the increasing popularity of commercially made bee hotels? Do you think they're harmful or beneficial, considering concerns for predation, spread of disease, and parasites?
I guess I have a mixed opinion of them. I do think, I mean, especially from a public education standpoint, I think having these bee boxes like in your yard, I think really can give you a better appreciation of what diversity is there. And I was a little bit critical of the study that was done in Ontario, where they said that these types of bee hotels attract non-native species. And what my complaint was is that study was restricted to Ontario, where you have the highest proportion of non-native species in Canada. I said, if you put those bee hotels in parts of the prairies or Newfoundland or up north, you're not going to find any non-native species because they're not there to begin with. But I think, the legitimate concern is that in the wild, I mentioned that beggars can't be choosers. So when bees find a cavity like what you'd find in a bee motel, it's usually one hole here, one hole there. You seldom get the density of available holes that you find there. So when these bees nest in these areas, you can get a lot of them really quickly. And as a bee researcher, one of the things that I find is cool is when I start to see the parasites get into these habitats, because then you start to appreciate what's happening in the bee community. But I think the concern is that some of these parasites potentially can wipe out the bees in those areas, especially if you keep the same block up over time. And the same is true for some of the pathogens. If you do get molds and other things like that in there, if you don't replace the nesting tubes every year, or at least clean them, it can cause problems. So I really think it depends on how you plan on managing these things in the end, that whether or not you can keep the bees clean or not. And when you look at commercial operations, like for the alfalfa leafcutter bee or blue orchard bee, the conditions they do with that, like they punch out the contents, and they're able to sterilize that nesting medium over and over again. So if you can make something where you can you can use paper tubes and replace them every year, I think that's going to greatly reduce your incidences of diseases and stuff like that. But when you have things nesting in high populations, the chances of some of the parasites or cuckoo bees finding them is going to be much greater too. So there's some pros and cons, but I think from a standpoint of education and just learning what the bees, but also providing them some homes, I think use sound judgment, and I think you'll be okay.
Thank you. I know we're running tight on time here. Would it be okay if we asked more questions, or do you have to get
Of
going?
course, yeah, of course.
Okay, awesome. Coming faster than you can answer them. um, Graham is wondering, given the different citizen science places to ID insects, which is the best to contribute to bee conservation knowledge? Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist or something else?
Um, for citizen science, I mean, I think, one of the big issues we have with like some of these photo-based citizen science things is that, for bumblebees, our ability to put names on them, I'd say probably 80% of the bumblebees we should be pretty good with, but it depends on the quality of the photograph. But there's some cases where we're never going to we'll know it's a bumblebee, but we won't know what species it is. And I know Bumblebee Watch gets a lot of publicity, and I think it's pretty good, but as a person that's interested in plants and photographing butterflies and insects and other things like that, I love iNaturalist because I think, if I'm out taking pictures, I don't just want to take pictures of bumblebees. I want to take pictures of all things. So I'll put a plug in for iNaturalist just because I also know anyone with an iNaturalist account can take part in not only uploading pictures and getting them identified, but the photographs themselves are exposed to a lot of other experts that can help put names on them, where Bumblebee Watch is a little bit more restrictive in that sense. Mm-hmm. So, and also iNaturalist, the data, research grade data on iNaturalist gets sent to GBIF, which is sort of the global conglomerate of specimen data that's used for conservation assessments and stuff. So the beautiful thing about iNaturalist is the data is publicly available to be used for these things, where Bumblebee Watch is a little bit more restrictive.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to educate the public regarding wild bee conservation, especially when the charisma of honeybees takes away the focus from wild bees?
That's a good question. It's been one of the concerns because, there's a lot of publicity for bee conservation, which the honeybee is focused, but it's the honeybee is not native, so it would be equivalent to using a chicken or a cow as models of bird and mammal conservation in North America, where these species are not native. I think honeybees should be considered an agricultural commodity, not, COSEWIC will never do an assessment of honeybees because it's a non-native species. But however, one of the things I'll say is that when we are concerned for honeybees, so honeybees are like other bees, they need food resources. When we provide food resources for honeybees, we're by default providing resources for other species as well. But I do think we have to make sure that when we're talking about bee conservation in North America, we mention that we're talking about native species and not honeybees. But I don't know. I think doing activities like this is a really good way to increase public education on them. But there's tons and tons of information. Those links that I provided, there's lots of good resources that people can read up, that are very public friendly for learning about what you can do for bees. And as someone that works at a museum, we do offer, if people are more interested in bumblebee taxonomy, for instance, or bee taxonomy, we do offer more specialized courses and those types of things as well. But yeah, talks like this, having seminars or other workshops that we can actually educate people, I think all of these things work really, really well.
Good, that's good to hear. The next question, would you be able to comment on the role of urban gardens or urban agriculture on native bee diversity and habitat? What would you recommend for urban settings?
Urban centers are kind of neat. I know they're getting lots of publicity, because they can support bee diversity, and I'm not discouraging people from doing that, but typically in urban settings you get a lot, especially in the East Coast, you get a lot of non-native species as well. But so I would say there is an important role for urban centers, especially if you're carefully researching which plant species you could be planting to assist with local populations. Native plants are the best things you can plant for native bees. But if you have things that are not native. Actually look at them when they're flowering and see, what's actually visiting them, and you can quickly learn, okay, this is something that, no pollinators are interested in. I guess the reason, I think urban centers can provide lots of food for the local bee populations, but from a standpoint of bee conservation, it's the natural habitats that we really, really have to have our focus on for conservation. So parks, things like that have lots of land, lots of areas of native plants, I think are really, if we're really interested in conserving native bee populations, it's those large stands of, keeping habitat as natural as possible is really what we want to do, though we can create small havens for bees within urban centers. So I would encourage people to, to continue gardening and putting in native plant gardens in urban centers, because it does help out the local populations.
Awesome. That is good to know. And a listener named Bet says there's always a focus on native plants, but non-native plants sometimes seem to be hotspots. Canada thistle, bluey, dandelion, particularly in shoulder seasons. Is this because they are available during those times when other native plants aren't blooming? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's part of it, but I also think when I look at, sometimes when I'm collecting bees, I'll pull over on the roadside and there'll be like large stands of sweet yellow clover and things like that, which aren't native, but because there's so much of it, I think there are some bee species that have really learned to take that plant. But I've also, when I go into those areas, I find a lot of honeybees and alfalfa leafcutter bees, which themselves are not native species as well. So I'm not saying there's not a place for exotics, and quite frankly, we almost have to live with some of the ones that are already established. But I would say that, those types of plants seem to be good for those generalist pollinators or generalist bees that I was talking about. For some of the rare things which have very narrow pollen requirements, they're not doing anything at all. And I'll also say that in places like Ontario, where we do have, some good documented cases of bees, they've also got their floral hosts with them there as well. So probably the plants were brought in, and the bees that specialize on them came in with those plants, because some of them will nest in stems and stuff like that. So in some cases, you get exotic bees that need these exotic plants. But so it's, a bit of a sort of a catch-22. So I agree, some of those plants are very good hotspots for bees, but when you start to look at the diversity on them, you're probably helping those, bees that are not at risk to begin with.
That makes sense. One last question, if that's okay. How do we take general life history into protective legislation for pollinators? How do we protect those with unique life histories or specialists that don't fit the general trend? Or are indicator species the best to represent general trends?
That's a good question. It's sort of why when I started working on the cuckoo bees, cuckoo bees are taxonomically among the most difficult, but I also think there's some putting a cuckoo bee as the poster child for bees is not necessarily, it's like having lice or something like that, or a bed bug as a poster child for insect conservation. A little bit, in terms of they're not as appealing. Like a big bumblebee certainly is more appealing, but basically when we do the conservation assessments, like that wild species one I show you, the NatureServe protocol allows us to take into consideration some of those life history traits. And I think, and this comes back to the question about urban centers, is that I think when we start to try to promote bee conservation or pollinator conservation, we have to let people know, like, it's sort of why it's not just about providing flowers, it's the natural habitat that has to be conserved, because it's really only in those natural settings is where you'll start to find those very, very peculiar life history traits or that levels of specialization that you're not going to find in an urban center or an agricultural field. So I think, like for other groups of organisms, we have to make stronger linkages between the organisms that we're interested in conserving and the ecosystem that they're in. So approaches which are more ecosystem based, that incorporate the unique species that are there, is probably a better strategy than just to have a poster child bumblebee, for instance. So I think we really have to make strong links, and that's sort of why we did the the work where we looked at a very broad scale, so ecozone, but looking at the species there and then breaking it into how many cuckoos are there, how many pollen specialists are there, how many bees winter as adults versus winter as larvae in those habitats. When we start breaking down the bee populations like that and then linking it to the landscape, there's no national park in the Okanagan, for instance. There's conservation properties there, but I mean, basically, if significant land was conserved in the Okanagan, for instance, 2/3 of Canada's bee species, could be conserved just by doing that alone. So, yeah, I think we have to look more beyond just the individual bee species and start thinking broader, so the landscapes that they use as well.
Great, thanks for that answer. It looks like that's all the time we have today. So I really want to thank you for the really, really informative presentation. It was really fascinating, and it was very well received by our listeners. There's been a lot of people writing about how great of a presentation was. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Sorry I took a bit longer, but it's...
Oh no, that's okay. I think we're all glued to the screen here. To all of our attendees out there, thank you so much for tuning in for our second last Prairie's Got the Goods Week webinar. We have one more webinar left about carbon sequestration, so you can register for that tomorrow or anytime, and I'll be happening tomorrow at noon. When you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate it. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.